Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're chasing one of the most enduring legends in world history, the search for El Dorado. If you've never heard of it, El Dorado was said to be a city of unimaginable wealth, hidden somewhere in the vast landscapes of South America. For centuries, explorers told stories of kings covered in gold dust, lakes filled with treasure, and entire kingdoms shimmering with riches. The promise of finding it sent countless expeditions deep into jungles, mountains, and rivers, often with disastrous results. But El Dorado was more than just a story of gold. It was a tale of how myths grow, how geography shapes imagination, and how the hunger for wealth and glory could drive people to the edge of the known world. Tonight, we'll follow the explorers who searched for it, the myths that fed it, and the history that slowly unraveled the mystery. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're lying down for the night, or simply curious about the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. At dawn on a high Andean plateau, when the mist still clung to the ravines and the first light struck the rims of the mountains, a procession moved toward a circular lake, the color of burnished jade. The Muisca called the lake Guatavita. To them it was not a curious geological bowl in the earth, but a living presence, a portal that linked the everyday world to a realm of gods and ancestors. Musicians with reed flutes and drums kept a steady pulse. Priests chanted invocations to Sway, the sun, and to Chia, the moon. Nobles walked in ordered ranks, adorned with pectorals and ear spools that flashed with every step. In the center, standing upon a raft plaited from reeds and canes, was the new ruler of the southern Muisca, the Zipa of Bacata. His body glistened. Attendants had anointed him with sticky resins and dusted him with powdered metal until he shone like the morning star. The Spanish would later give him a name that meant the Golden One. What took place upon that raft is the seed of one of the most powerful legends in the early modern world. The ceremony was an investiture as well as a vow. The gilded ruler stood amid mounds of offerings, baskets brimming with emeralds from the Muzo and Somondoko valleys, tunjos of cast metal in human and animal shapes, and delicate ornaments hammered from an alloy the Muisca favored, a blend of gold and copper that Europeans later called tumbaga. Priests and attendants steadied the raft and pushed off from the shore. The crowd, spread along the slope like a living amphitheater, fell quiet. When the raft reached the middle of the lake, the musicians lifted their volume, the chants rose, and the ruler stepped forward to cast treasure into the water. This was not a display of private wealth. To the Muisca, who did not use gold as money, the metal had a spiritual charge. It was the sweat of the Sunday. To offer it to the lake was to return a divine substance to a divine being. The Muisca world was a tapestry carefully woven. They spoke a Chibcha language and lived in a confederation of chiefdoms on the high savannas of what is now central Colombia. The southern realm centered on Bacata, near present-day Bogota, and the northern realm around Hunza, now Tunja. A religious authority at Sogamoso tended the great Temple of the Sun, a structure that Spanish chroniclers described with wonder before it was put to the torch. The Muisca economy was rich in salt and fertile ground. They boiled brine in ceramic pans at Zipaquira and Nemocon to make salt cakes that traveled along trade paths across the Andes. They traded cotton, coca leaves, and beautifully worked metal, and received in return feathers, shells, and the deep green stones that the Spaniards would liken to living fire. It was in this setting, prosperous and ordered, that the investiture at Guatavita made cultural sense. The ruler, by coating himself in radiant dust, enacted a union between person and cosmos. He pledged to govern in harmony with the powers that sustained the land. Spanish writers later claimed that the gilded ruler leaped into the lake to wash away the gold as his people cried out in joy. The detail is vivid and may preserve a memory of purification. Whether he plunged or whether he bathed slowly while attendants poured water over him, the meaning is the same. The body once coated in brilliance returned to ordinary flesh. The wealth had been offered. The compact between human authority and sacred landscape had been renewed. The raft turned back toward the shore, lighter now, and the crowd released a collective breath that had been held through the rite. The objects given to the lake were not cast off casually. Muisca metalworking combined ritual purpose with skilled technique. Goldsmiths used lost wax casting, building small wax models that were coated in clay, fired to harden the mold and melt out the wax, then filled with molten alloy. The resulting tunjos and figurines bear details that repay close attention. You can see stylized headdresses and staffs of office, musicians with flutes, feline and avian forms that evoke the world of spirits. Some pieces are the size of a finger. Others form small tableaux in which a leader stands upon a platform while attendants flank him with banners. The artistry collapsed the boundary between representation and reality. To place these figures in the lake was to let images stand in for the community itself, a people who sought favor for harvests, safe journeys, and victory in war. Why Guatavita, and why a lake at all? The Muisca landscape was crowded with sacred sites. Peaks and caves carried stories from the deep past. Lakes were especially potent. They were sources of water on a plateau that depended on seasonal rains, and they were imagined as places where powerful beings resided. Guatavita, nearly circular and cupped by steep ridges, appeared as a natural basin built to receive offerings. Later scholars would argue about the lake's geological origin and propose sinkhole collapse or other mechanisms, but for the people who gathered at its shore, the meaning required no treatise. The lake was a person. To feed it with precious things was to bind the community to its guardians. The first Europeans to hear of the ceremony did not hear the metaphysics. They heard the gold. Stories reached the Caribbean and the northern coasts from traders and captives, and from intermediaries who traveled between the lowlands and the highlands. There was talk of a chieftain who covered himself in powder and of lakes that contained a fortune. Some of the earliest Spanish expeditions into the interior passed through territories where Muisca goods had already circulated for generations. When they asked where the gold came from, informants pointed toward the high plateau. When they asked who controlled it, voices spoke of a lord at Bacatá and of a rival to the north. By the time organized entradas fought their way up the valleys toward the Bogotá plain, the legend had already begun to change. A ritual of giving had become a rumor of accumulation. A gilded man had become a city of gold. That transformation says as much about the listeners as about the source. The men who trailed behind the standard of Castile had just seen Tenochtitlan fall to Cortés and had watched Pizarro dismantle the Inca. They had experienced cargoes so rich that royal treasuries in Seville groaned beneath the weight. They were primed to believe that every rumor of abundance pointed toward another empire waiting to be seized. In their letters and journals, the words repeat like a spell. Riches, provinces, mines. They recorded the ornaments on the necks of women in coastal villages and imagined the veins from which those metals flowed. They heard of a lake where people cast treasure into the depths and imagined a vault. There is a revealing dissonance here. For the Muisca, the offerings were a bridge to the unseen. For the newcomers, the offerings were a bank account to be withdrawn. What can be stated securely from sources on both sides is this. The investiture at Lake Guatavita was remembered by Muisca descendants as the defining act of a new ruler. Gold dust was not decoration, but a sign. The raft existed, not as a poet's fancy, but as a platform built for a public rite. Emeralds and metalwork went into the water in quantities that astonished outsiders. Music and ceremony fused the community into a single body gathered around its leader. When the Spaniards finally reached the plateau in the late 1830s of the 16th century, they found abundant evidence of the Muisca fascination with gold and with lakes, although the specific investiture rite may already have faded by then. What they did not find was a metropolis clad in metal. The ritual had never promised that. It promised alignment between human rule and cosmic order. It promised favor, not bullion. Centuries later, a small object would surface near the town of Pasca. It was a cast tableau barely the length of a hand, a raft with a standing figure at its center and attendants grouped with banners and offerings. The scene was unmistakable. Here in miniature was the ceremony at Guatavita. The tiny faces stare forward as if caught in the bright moment before the treasure falls. That artifact, now in Bogotá, is an eloquent witness. The legend that convulsed half a continent began with a real people and a real rite, luminous and grave, meant to keep a world in balance. The story of El Dorado spread first as a rumor braided with other rumors, a strand of hearsay that slipped from village to village and from canoe to caravel long before it hardened into a place on a map. On the Caribbean islands in the first years after Columbus, Spaniards noted the abundance of native ornaments and the casual way people wore them. They saw nuggets hammered thin and bent into pendants, bright discs at the throat, bracelets, and nosepins that caught the Sunday. To men who served a crown that taxed treasure by the royal fifth, the conclusion was swift. There must be a source. The question was where. Along the coast of Tierra Firme, at the mouths of muddy rivers, and in settlements that appeared and vanished with the tides. Interpreters asked that question again and again. The answers pointed inward. Far in the highlands, informants said, lived a people who mastered the bright metal. Far inland, another said, there was a lord who bathed in gold dust and a lake that kept the offerings of his people. The rumor grew because it suited the times. Iberian conquest had already produced 2 thunderclaps. In Mexico, the fall of Tenochtitlan had delivered a royal windfall. In Peru, the seizure of Atahualpa had yielded a famous ransom, a chamber stacked with plates and cups and statues hammered from precious metal. Men in mail now drifted from the Isthmus to the Spanish Main with hardened expectations. Behind every mountain there would be a valley of tribute. Behind every village a tributary that led to a city. Even the language of the era primed them for the legend. Officials carved a province called Castile of the Gold from the mangrove coast of Darien. Adelantados carried patents that promised jurisdiction over lands they had yet to see. When they heard of a gilded lord and a wealth-filled lake, the thought formed at once. If a man could be golden, surely his capital would be as well. Across the Gulf in Spain, the crown needed bullion as badly as its agents desired it. Emperors were paying for continental wars. Italian bankers fronted the cash. The traffic of treasure kept the system in motion. It is not a stretch to say that the New World rumors found willing ears because Europe required them to be true. When the Augsburg banking house of the Welser family secured the right to colonize Venezuela in the late 1520s, they sent German captains with Spanish auxiliaries up the coastal rivers to search for a wealthy interior. Ambrosius Ainger, known in Castilian as Ambrosio Alfinger, led expeditions inland and died in the attempt. His successor, Georg von Speyer, marched into the Llanos, the vast grasslands that roll east of the mountains, and returned gaunt with tales of peoples who spoke of other peoples richer still. Nikolaus Federmann wandered for years between the Orinoco and the snow line, always a step behind a story that retreated before him. The German venture in Venezuela, called Little Venice, left little more than a ledger of debts and a string of graves, but it preserved one important element. The informants they pressed for clues always gestured toward the same horizon. The gold, they said, came from the uplands beyond the endless savanna. From the south, another current of rumor moved northward. After the killing of Atahualpa in Cajamarca, soldiers in the wake of Pizarro fanned out from the Sierra of Peru and Ecuador. Sebastián de Belalcázar seized Quito in 1534 and then pivoted toward the valleys of Popayan. In every new district, he asked the oldest of questions: where is the metal worked? Who commands the trade? The replies pointed further north to a cold plateau and to a people whose wealth was measured in emeralds and gold ornaments rather than in ingots. In those same years, a lawyer-turned-soldier named Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada led a column up the Magdalena River from Santa Marta. His party slogged through a corridor of swamp and gallery forest, built bridges from lianas, and ferried horses over black water that crawled with caimans. When they reached the high plains in 1537, they recognized the source of the whispering. Here were the Muisca. Here were tunjos and nose rings and pectorals by the basket. Here were emeralds that flashed the deep green of rainy season fields. The discovery did not end the rumor. It transformed it. Quesada found abundance and order, but no labyrinth of palaces plated in yellow. The gilded lord remained a story. The Spaniards asked where the rest had gone. The answer pointed to lakes, Guatavita, Siecha, Tota, places of sacrifice, the Muisca said, where offerings had been made to beings in the water. It is easy to see how ritual became arithmetic in the minds of the newcomers. If a people cast treasure into a sink of unknown depth for generations, then the sum must be astonishing. A rite was reframed as a vault. Within a year, Spaniards attempted the first crude lowering of Lake Guatavita. Laborers dug a gash into the crater rim with hand tools. The water fell a little. Mud slid. A few pieces appeared along the margins. The larger secret stayed hidden. The failure did not quench the idea. It strengthened it. Men convinced themselves that the real trove lay only a little deeper. Now a second and more consequential change took hold. El Dorado, the Golden One, shifted from a person into a destination. Chroniclers began to use the term as if it were a proper name for a land. Maps shaded a space with a name rather than a known shoreline. The legend migrated even as it thickened. One year, it hovered over the Bogotá plain. Then it slid east beyond the mountains. Then farther still into the basin of the Orinoco. The movement reflected the dynamics on the ground. The Muisca investiture that had generated the tale may have ceased by the time Quesada occupied Bacata. Survivors remembered it, and priests later recorded their memories. But that living act had become a memory by the late 1530s. The Spaniards who had missed the ceremony by a generation clutched its echo as a clue. They were determined not to miss what lay beyond. Along the edges of this growing story are the translators and guides, whose names were often not recorded. They ferried meanings across cultures and across fear. The questions were sharp and often leading. Where is the road to the province rich in metal? Which river runs to the cities of the gilded lord? To answer such questions, to appease a captor, was to point into the distance. Those who lived by the forest and the river would gesture toward the highlands. Those who lived by the highlands would gesture toward the forest and the river. In this way, El Dorado retreated in perfect step with the advance of the men who sought it. Each league that the Spaniards covered created a new frontier on the far side of the next ridge, which was precisely where informants said the wealth would be found. Rumor also carried a moral charge that the conquerors ignored. The Muisca gifted gold to lakes because it was a sacred medium. Spanish captains seized gold from temples and treated lakes as places to be drained because they saw the metal as an instrument of royal finance. The same object meant opposite things and so drove opposite behaviors. From that misalignment, the legend drew its strange energy. To the Muisca, the tale of a man who became golden and then washed away the radiance with sacred water affirmed the cycle of gift and renewal. To the Spaniards, the same tale proved that somewhere there must be a store of wealth waiting to be seized. A story of sanctity became an itinerary. By 1538, the rumor brought three rivals to the same plateau: Quesada from the north, Federman from the east, and Belalcázar from the south converged on the heartland of the Muisca and quarreled over who had arrived first and who had the right to govern. Their meeting at the newly named Santa Fe de Bogotá is one of those scenes in which the whole pattern of a century can be glimpsed in a single room. Each held partial knowledge, each carried triumphs and losses from the march, and none possessed the prize that rumor had promised. They would sail to Spain to argue their claims before judges in Seville. Behind them, other captains packed mules and built brigantines. The rumor had already leapt beyond Bogotá to a place no one had seen. The last act of this first chapter, in the story of El Dorado, is quiet and telling. A Spanish priest in the next century recorded, from the mouths of Muisca elders, the description of the investiture at Lake Guatavita. He wrote of the raft, the gold dust, the offerings that sank into the green. He wrote of a rite that once bound a community to its gods. What the conquistadors heard in those words was something else entirely. They heard directions, and so the rumor, born in a high, cold amphitheater of water and rock, moved out along the rivers to the sea, and then back again with armed men. It was already a legend, and it was just beginning. They came up the Magdalena in slow stages, by dugout and by brigantine, and when the water narrowed, they marched along its banks, where the jungle pressed like a living wall. The column that Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada led out of Santa Marta in the year 1536 was large enough to look formidable on paper, and yet woefully small against a continent. Sun and fever stripped it down. Horses went lame in the black mud of the swamps. Steel corroded. Men who had crossed an ocean found themselves fighting insects that never slept. Still, they persisted, because a rumor had taken hold of them. Somewhere beyond the river valley rose a high, cold plain, where a people worked gold and emeralds, and made offerings to lakes. The route that Quesada chose was not blind guesswork. Since the first Spanish footholds on the Caribbean shore, pilots and traders had learned that the great river flowed out of an interior that rose toward the clouds. The Magdalena ran between two mountain spines, the central and the eastern ranges of the Andes, and somewhere on that eastern shoulder lay a temperate plateau that natives described with a single word: cold. For men who had baked along the coast, the promise of clear air and open grassland felt like an omen. So they pushed upriver, felling trees to bridge creeks, sewing up dugouts when they split, trading trinkets for food when they could, and taking food when they could not. They buried comrades in damp earth without markers, because the march would not wait on grief. As the banks gave way to foothills, the jagged path became a staircase. Behind them, the Magdalena twisted like a strip of hammered silver. Before them, the slopes steadied and opened into a bowl of land set 2,500 meters above the sea. This was the Cundiboyacense Plateau, a great natural amphitheater with thin, clear light and nights that could bite. Here the Spaniards found what they had pursued. The Muisca were not a rumor. They were a confederation with priestly centers, councils of lords, markets, salt works, and a calendar that set the rhythm of sowing and harvest. They spoke a Chibcha tongue. They spun cotton. They wove mantles with designs that marked rank. They considered gold a noble medium rather than money. The first encounters were a mixture of awe and violence, as first encounters then tended to be. Chroniclers noted fields laid out in clean rectangles and houses roofed with thatch, and they noted with equal care the glint of metal at ears and throats. Scouts brought in reports of towns that glowed at dawn with burnished ornaments. Pressure followed. Quesada marched on Bogotá, the southern capital, and then on the northern seat at Hunza. The two Muisca realms, led by the Zipa in the south and the Zaque in the north, had been rivals before the foreigners arrived. Spanish commanders exploited that reality with practiced speed. Some Muisca lords offered tribute to keep the strangers moving. Others gathered spearmen on ridges and contested the advance. Neither strategy preserved independence for long. Names from the Muisca annals enter the Spanish record at this point and are twisted by foreign spelling. Tisquesuasa, the zipper of Bacata, was caught in the storm of invasion and died during the fighting. Not in a set battle, but in the chaos of raids and pursuits that followed the Spanish entry onto the plain. Quemuenchatoca, the Zaque of Hunza, fell into Spanish hands, and with him, a portion of the ceremonial wealth of his court. Sajipa, also known as Saquesazipa, succeeded in the south and tried to bargain with the invaders, to pay them off with gold and emeralds, and thus save what could be saved. The bargaining failed. The logic of the conquest continued to grind forward. What the Spaniards seized in these months astonished them. Even when they understood that the Muisca did not mine and pour ingots as the Inca did, they found a profusion of crafted metal, tunjos, those small cast figures that bear the imprint of lost wax technique, emerged from shrines and houses in bundles. Nose rings and diadems, pectorals and bells, tumbling from baskets when they were counted for the royal fifth, confirmed to Quesada and his captains that they had reached a land where gold was common. Emeralds from the mines at Muzo and Somondoco shone like pieces of the plateau sky trapped in stone. Salt, boiled from brine at Zipaquira and Nemicon and pressed into cakes, explained the trading networks that the Spaniards had traced long before their arrival. Here, they thought, was the proof that the old rumor had pointed them to the right highland plain. And yet there was no city of gold. There were holy places where offerings had been made. There were lakes that the Muisca approached with reverent caution. There were memories of a ruler who had, at the beginning of his reign, taken on a skin of brilliance and pledged himself to the powers within the water. But there was no metropolis walled with plates of yellow metal. The disappointment did not lessen their appetite. It redirected it. The Spaniards demanded to know where the rest had gone. The answers turned their eyes from temples to crater lakes. Guatavita was the first to seize their imagination. A near-perfect circle in a green cup of earth, it looked to European eyes like a basin designed to be emptied. Within a few years of the occupation of Bacata, Spaniards undertook the first crude attempt to draw down its level. They set gangs to carve a notch in the earthen rim. They lowered the water a few meters, exposing muddy terraces that promised much and yielded little. Some ornaments and a small raft of cast metal were scooped from the ooze along the edges. Mudslides ate the work as fast as men could dig. The lake held on to its secret. The men with picks withdrew angrier rather than chastened. If a little effort had produced a handful of treasure, then a greater effort must conceal a trove. Quesada had other tasks than to remain on the lip of a lake supervising shovels. He had to found towns to hold the plateau and to stage the next outward push. He laid out Santa Fe de Bogotá, a grid on the savannah that joined other Spanish footholds rising across the Americas. He sent lieutenants to plant new settlements at Tunja and Vélez. He partitioned lands and people in encomiendas that bound native labor and tribute to Spanish patrons. He set scribes to recording the new order so that judges in distant Seville would recognize his claim. He did not forget wealth while he did it. Nothing in the machinery of 16th century empire allowed a captain to forget wealth for long. The Spaniards were not content to master only the plateau. Their gaze slid, as rumor slid, toward the horizons beyond. To the east lay the Llanos, and beyond them river systems that ran into the Orinoco. To the south lay cloud forests and the headwaters of 1,000 streams that fed the Amazon. From Bogotá, the land itself seemed to suggest multiple paths. It was at this moment, with Quesada consolidating power in the north, that other Spaniards arrived from other directions. Sebastián de Belalcázar came up from the south after seizing Quito. Nicolaus Federman, the German in royal service, pushed in from the Llanos. Their convergence in 1538 produced the awkward scene in which three rivals argued over precedence and jurisdiction while seated in the same raw town. None of them had found the fabled Golden City. All of them insisted that they had earned the right to keep looking. The Muisca world, battered and reorganized, endured the changes as best it could. Priests in Sogamoso would soon see the Temple of the Sun burn. Markets continued under new rules. Tribute now flowed along new channels. The lakes remained. If anything, they grew more charged in the Spanish imagination, because each failure to find a mountain of treasure on the plateau made the idea of a vast underwater hoard feel more plausible. It is revealing to read the Spanish letters from these years. The writers move with ease from a catalogue of very real wealth to a confident assertion that still greater riches lie just outside the frame. When experience disappointed, belief supplied the difference. Quesada eventually sailed for Spain to defend his claims before the Council of the Indies. He was an able advocate of his own importance and a shrewd man who understood that in the end, authority flowed from royal favor as much as from the sword. He left behind officers who adopted the same posture he had carried for 2 years. They faced outward. They haunted the edges of lakes with sounding lines. They questioned guides about trails that dropped off the eastern scarp toward grasslands and then toward jungle. They prepared boats in towns that were hundreds of miles from the sea. The logic was simple. If the plateau had given them gold without mines and emeralds without smelters, then the true mother lode must lie in the directions to which every informant pointed. Somewhere to the east, men said. The land fell away into a country where wealth was gathered in ways that would stagger European imagination. There is a final image worth pausing over before the narrative follows the searchers to the horizons. On the plaza of the New Bogotá, under a sky that could go from diamond blue to hard rain in an hour, a scribe bends over a ledger of the Royal Fifth and writes neat columns of figures. The entries list rings and plates and small cast figures of men and birds and gods. The book glows as brightly as the piles on the table, because numbers are what the crown understands. That ledger also records a threshold. The Spaniards have captured a world that used gold to speak to the sacred. They have decided that the sacred has left a trail that can be followed. They will follow it off the edge of the plateau and into a river country that few of them can imagine. The search for El Dorado is about to leave the clear air of the Andes for the green heat beyond. The rumor that drew men off the Andean heights and into the green hollows of the east promised two things at once. It promised a land where wealth was commonplace, and it promised a grove of trees that exhaled the scent of spice. The Spaniards called the first El Dorado and the second the country of cinnamon. To men who measured distance in hunger and hardship, the idea that a single march could reach both was irresistible. Quito was the staging ground. In the year 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro took command there with authority to explore the unknown lands beyond the Cordillera. He gathered a force that looked impressive in a plaza and small in a forest. A few hundred Spaniards with pikes and arquebuses. Several thousand indigenous allies and porters burdened with the tools of a mobile colony. Herds of pigs driven for meat. Packs of dogs that would become both companions and, when starvation closed its hand, food. The route climbed for a time through cloud forest where moss hung like old banners from the trees, and then tilted down toward the east. What had been a world of crisp air and stony ridges softened into slope after slope of sodden soil. The great river system that gathers the rains of the Andes into a single current waited somewhere below. The expedition descended toward it at a pace set by mud and fever. In the camps that followed one another down the mountain, men spoke of perfume on the wind. The promise of cinnamon was no idle hope. The Iberian world in those years had been transformed by pepper and clove and nutmeg. Fortunes were made in the east by those who found the groves and the ports where spices could be had. Reports out of Quito had spoken of trees with aromatic bark on the far side of the Sierra. A country of cinnamon in the Americas would be a wonder to rival anything in Asia. Pizarro cut his way toward it with a will sharpened by tales of gold. The rumor said that somewhere beyond the first rivers lived peoples who adorned themselves in the bright metal and built villages along waterways wide enough to carry fleets of canoes. Guides who knew the foothills agreed that rich lands lay somewhere farther on. When pressed, they pointed east. It was always east. Weeks became months. The file of men wound into a maze of tributaries and morasses. The expedition reached the Coca River and built a rough brigantine to ferry supplies and the sick. The river offered a moving road, but it extracted a price in control. At the confluence with the Napo, in a camp gnawed by hunger, Gonzalo Pizarro faced a choice that every commander fears. His stores were failing and his men were gaunt. He could risk the whole on a long detour to find food, or he could detach a smaller party to forage ahead. He chose the latter. In late December of that year, he ordered his lieutenant Francisco de Orellana to take the brigantine with a few dozen men and follow the Napo downstream to the first large village, secure maize and cassava there, and then row back against the current to rejoin the main body. It was an order that looked sensible on a map and nearly impossible on a river. Orellana pushed off with a priest named Gaspar de Carvajal and a company of men who could still pull an oar. The Napo took them like a mill race. Within days, they realized that the plan to return against such a force of water would strand them in the current with exhausted arms and dwindling food. They made a decision that history remembers as both betrayal and destiny. They would continue downstream in the hope that the river would lead them out to the sea. If they lived, they could bring word and ships. If they died, there would at least be a record in Carvajal's hand of what they had seen. The record is one of the great documents of the age of exploration. Carvajal's account, kept with a pen steadied in a rolling hull, describes a river world that few Europeans had imagined. Orellana's small craft slid past banks lined with villages that seemed to run on for hours. Granaries stood on stilts. Paths led inland from wharves hewn in the earth. There were gardens of maize and beans and fruit trees, and at intervals roads that looked as if they had been laid out with thought rather than grown like vines. The men counted houses in the hundreds. They saw canoes that carried entire families. They met chiefs who received them with gifts and chiefs who barred their passage with war. In Carvajal's vision, the river was not a wilderness. It was a corridor of societies that had mastered it. Somewhere below the mouth of a great black river that joined from the left, in a region where the banks rose in bluffs, Orellana's men fought a pitched battle with a force that included women among its archers. The Spaniards had seen women who fought before in the Andes and in the Caribbean, but the sight of organized companies commanded allegiance in their memory. It was Carvajal who later wrote that these women reminded the Spaniards of the warrior women of antique story. The name stuck. Orellana began to speak of the river as the river of the Amazons. The tag would become cartography and then habit. It captures the blend of fact and legend that rode with the little brigantine as it hurried east. They also heard, by gesture and through interpreters, of peoples called Omagua who lived along broad reaches of the river far ahead. The name would later be glossed by outsiders as a term that meant head flattener, a reference to a custom that altered the skull shape of infants to mark identity. What mattered to Orellana was less the etymology than the reports of scale and wealth. The Omagua, he was told, lived in large, planned settlements. They fished the main channel and farmed the rich soils of its floodplain. They wore ornaments of bright metal and bartered along distances that made the newcomers blink. In one village, Orellana saw pottery so fine that a European might have sworn it had come from an urban kiln. In another, he saw causeways that kept feet dry even in the wettest season. Each such observation fed a single conclusion. Somewhere in the immensity of this river world were societies of a size and complexity that could sustain abundance. The Spaniards called that abundance El Dorado because they had no other word for it. The cinnamon proved to be a more elusive promise. Carvajal describes trees with aromatic bark, but what the men found would not have rivaled the fine cinnamon of Ceylon. The fragrance sweetened a few nights in a long voyage and then was gone. The lesson came slowly. The hope of a spice that could be sold in Seville for a fortune had helped to justify a march that would take more lives than any cargo could repay. When the men spoke of cinnamon in later years, it sounded like a charm that had failed, a whispered word that lost power once the river brought them to the sea. Orellana's party built a second brigantine when the first began to fail, sawing planks from driftwood and from trees felled on shore, caulking seams with pitch and fiber, and nursing battered nails through one more round of use. They slipped past a delta that widened so slowly that no one on board could say the exact place where river became ocean. By mid-year of 1542, they were out on the Atlantic, emaciated and astonished that they were alive. They made their way along the coast to the Caribbean and thence to Spain. In their wake, they left a river 2,000 miles long with a name that would endure and a new geometry in the imaginations of those who still sought El Dorado. The lesson was simple. The prize might not be on a cold plateau. It might be hidden somewhere in the endless green where roads were made of water. Behind them, Gonzalo Pizarro hauled what remained of his original force back toward Quito. His men had eaten leather and boiled belts. They had slaughtered their dogs and then carried the bones because they could not bear to discard a last reserve of calories. When they climbed onto the plaza they had left, they were skeletons wearing rusted mail. The ledger of that expedition would be written in a few stark lines. No cinnamon that could justify a trade. No golden city captured. A river discovered that would reorder maps and lure a new wave of seekers down its course. Reports of the Omagua and other river peoples carried an implication that no one in Spain missed. Where there were organized villages, there might be treasuries. The dream turned its face decisively toward the east. Orellana returned once more to the great river under a royal license to settle it, and died there, a victim of the very geography he had revealed. Others followed in smaller parties. They carried Carvajal's pages as both guide and incantation. In every company, a few men swore that the next bend would reveal the wealth they sought. The rest learned to live with the uncertainty that defines a place so vast that even a success could feel like a rumor confirmed only for a day. From Quito to the Amazon mouth, the trail of this episode is written in a chain of camps and graves that arcs across a continent. In the chronicles that survived, the episode has a different shape. It is an arrow driven east by hunger and imagination that pierced a world of rivers and was carried by the current all the way to the sea. The last great fever of the 16th century did not begin with a tyrant. It began with an official commission and a promise that the old rumor might finally be made solid. In the year 1560, the viceroy in Lima authorized a fresh entrada to seek the wealthy provinces that Indians called Omagua and to probe the river headwaters, where some said the Golden Kingdom lay. The command went to Pedro de Ursua, a seasoned captain from Navarre who had built towns in New Granada and who knew how to keep hard men moving. He mustered several hundred Spaniards and many more Indian auxiliaries and enslaved porters. They brought arquebuses, pikes, hunting dogs, carpenters' tools to build boats, and the unshakable conviction that the richest land in the world lay just out of sight. Trailing in Ursua's shadow was a stocky veteran from Guipúzcoa, who had grown sour with age and long service. His name was Lope de Aguirre. He had fought in Peru, clashed with magistrates, and brooded over wounds both real and imagined. Even before the expedition left the Sierra and dropped into the green throat of the forests, Aguirre's resentment simmered. He paid close attention to each slight and each favor that Ursua bestowed. He registered with particular fury that the commander kept company with a noble lady named Inez de Atienza, who traveled with the column in a curtained litter. To Aguirre, who measured every dispensation against his own status, it was proof that the leader cared more for comfort than for discipline. To the men who trudged behind in mud that swallowed ankles and sometimes knees, it was one more story to grumble about under their breath. The descent into the Amazonian watershed worked its usual transformation. Weeks became months. The air turned heavy and wet. Armor rusted. Powder spoiled unless it was kept dry with the vigilance of a parent with a fevered child. Men ate short rations. They slept on damp ground and woke to the itch of bites that rose in red welts. Ursua pressed on because he knew that to stop was worse. He ordered a brigantine built where a tributary widened, then another when the first showed its limits. The expedition began to move by water when it could, and to drag the boats when it must. At every halt, Indians were questioned. Where were the populous lands described in Quechua and in the tongues of the forest? Where did the people of Amagua live? Where was the province of cinnamon that had tempted Gonzalo Pizarro before? Fingers pointed downriver. The answers never wavered. On New Year's Day of 1561, far from any church, the expedition made camp along a reach of river, where the banks rose a little higher than the floodplain. That night, Aguirre and a circle of allies put their plan in motion. Ursua had lost favor with some by failing to deliver food, and by favoring friends in disputes. Aguirre used those angers as kindling. Men with knives slipped through the dark from hammock to hammock. By dawn, the commander was dead. The next day, the conspirators fashioned a political fig leaf. They proclaimed a pliant nobleman named Fernando de Guzman as their leader and gave him a grand title. He was called Prince of Terra Firma. He was a prince only until Aguirre grew tired of the charade. Before long, Guzman joined Ursua in an unmarked grave, and Aguirre stood openly at the head of the company. The transformation from royal mission to outlaw march happened in a handful of days. Aguirre forced the men to swear that they would follow him rather than the king. He spoke the words that would make his name a byword in every province where Spaniards ruled. He renounced Philip and the entire Spanish order in the Indies. In the letter that he later addressed to the king from the Caribbean coast, he justified his revolt with a mixture of savage logic and personal grievance. He said the officials of Peru were corrupt and that he went to war not against Spain but against tyranny. He signed that long indictment with a phrase that stuck to him like a brand. Lope de Aguirre, he wrote, the wrath of God. Under Aguirre, the company moved as a gang rather than as an army. He murdered rivals as a lesson. He starved prisoners to bring others to heel. He tore down, one by one, those he suspected of wavering, until men who had been bold with Ursua were silent in his presence. All the while the river ran on. The flotilla slid into reaches where the current gathered force, and into reaches where the water spread and braided among islands. They saw signs of riverine societies like those Orellana had described nearly 20 years earlier. Villages, canoe traffic, gardens on high ground above the flood. Sometimes a chief traded food for iron tools. Sometimes warriors massed on the banks and put flights of arrows into the boats so thickly that men swore they could walk across them. Aguirre answered generosity with contempt and resistance with killing. He sought not the goodwill of those who could save him, but the fear that he considered his due. Downstream, the brown river took on the scale of a sea. The men tasted salt on the wind. The water freshened, and then the tide began to tug beneath their hulls. They had ridden the Amazon to its mouth. No one could claim that Aguirre was a coward. To run that distance in frail craft takes a certain terrible courage. But the courage was all in the service of a plan that had turned inward. He cared less about finding a golden city now than about proving himself invincible. He seized coastal craft when he could and bullied pilots into steering west along the Caribbean to Isla Margarita. There, as if to announce to every official from Mexico to Panama what he had become, he took the island by force. He executed the governor. He ordered homes sacked. He made speeches in the plaza in which he called himself a prince in a new order and promised his men rewards that would be gathered from the mainland. He moved to the Venezuelan coast and marched inland toward the towns of Borbarata, Valencia, and Barquisimeto. He issued proclamations in ringing language to the vecinos of the colonies that lay in his path. He posed as a reformer and as a liberator from corrupt magistrates. The residents read the words and then took note of the trail that followed him. Theft, burning, and the killing of anyone who failed to submit. Royal forces gathered from many directions. Commanders loyal to the king marched from New Granada. Colonists from the Venezuelan towns assembled militia. Indian auxiliaries who had no love for any Spaniard nevertheless preferred an order they knew to the promises of a rebel who could not keep his own followers fed. As the circle tightened, Aguirre grew more violent and more alone. In a moment that even his admirers could not soften, he killed his own daughter Elvira rather than see her captured. It was an act that he explained as a mercy through gritted teeth, and that others read as the final confession of a soul that had severed all bonds. His men deserted in twos and threes. Some slipped to the royalists by night. Others flung down their arms and let themselves be taken. The end came on the outskirts of Barquisimeto in the autumn of 1561. A volley of shot tore through the last tight knot of rebels. Aguirre fell raving and was finished at close range. His body was quartered and displayed in the towns he had terrorized so that no one would miss the lesson. The rebellion of Lope de Aguirre did not bring the seekers of El Dorado any closer to what they desired. It left them with a caution that was as vivid as any gold plate. The search for a kingdom of wealth had turned one of their own into a declared enemy of the crown. The rumor that had spurred men through rivers and swamps could, in the wrong hands, become a flag for mutiny. There is a grim symmetry in the way the episode closes. Aguirre set out to find a province that did not exist. He invented a cause to bind men to him when hunger and fear had emptied their minds of other loyalties. Then he died to prove how empty the invention had always been. The march of Lope de Aguirre burned itself into memory because it ended in open revolt. Most quests for the Golden Kingdom left fainter trails. They ended in silence and in the long forgetting of names. Yet these quieter failures are as important to the story as the famous mutiny, because they show how the pattern repeated with numbing regularity across the middle years of the 16th century. Captains assembled small armies, pried information from interpreters, and carried provision for what they imagined would be a season. A year later, or two, a handful of survivors limped out with spears that had been cut down to walking sticks. In their mouths were the same phrases that had launched them. Farther on, richer provinces, people who wore the sun at their throats. Hernan Perez de Quesada, brother to Gonzalo, is one such figure who illustrates the rhythm of pursuit and return. In the wake of the occupation of the Bogotá Plateau, he gathered a company with the express purpose of reaching the source of the rumor that the plateau itself seemed only to reflect. His column moved southward and then east, off the cool grasslands and into forests where the trees closed above the path like a vault. For months, the men traced tributaries that ran toward the Meta and the distant Orinoco. They suffered the common ills of the entradas. Feet rotted in wet boots, powder spoiled. Beards grew grey on faces that had been young when the march began. At intervals they met villages that bartered food for beads and knives. At other times they found houses burned and fields abandoned because word of the strangers had preceded them. The expedition staggered out at last, not at a golden city, but at the frontier of another Spaniard's jurisdiction. Belalcázar's men from Popayan took in the gaunt intruders and handed them bread and contempt in equal measure. Hernan had proved a point that no one wanted to admit. The farther you went, the farther the legend placed its object. The German venture, known as Little Venice, produced its own chain of losses that loom large when set beside their meager gains. Ambrosius Ainger marched from Coro and died of a poisoned wound after a fight with Indians in a region of lagoons. Georg von Speyer led men into the Llanos for years and returned with fewer comrades than he had set out with, having converted coin into graves without any compensating treasure. Nicolas Federman wandered between the Orinoco and the Andes, and eventually stumbled into Bogotá from the east in the same year that Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada arrived from the north and Sebastián de Belalcázar from the south. Federman had endured much and added little to the record beyond a demonstration that determination alone could not conjure a kingdom. Among the Welser agents, the most haunting story belongs to Philip von Hutten. In the early 1540s, he led several forays south and east from the coastal settlements into the interior with a loyal companion, Bartholomeus Welser the Younger. They heard the familiar boasts from informants and prisoners that somewhere beyond the next watercourse lay towns where nobles wore hammered plates and where public stores were measured in piles. They pressed on until their ranks were threadbare and their lead was down to a handful of shot per man. When they turned back toward the coast, they were thinner, harder, and in their minds wealthier with information if not with metal. They walked into a political trap rather than a welcome. A jealous Spanish governor, Juan de Carvajal, seized them at El Tocuyo and had both men put to death in the year 1546. The manner of the end stands as a parable. The expedition survived the interior, only to be broken by the human storm on the fringe of empire. From the south, another set of losses traced the routes of Gonzalo Pizarro's forays beyond Quito after the fall of the Inca. The relief brigantine that Francisco de Orellana rowed to the sea is rightly celebrated, but Orellana's own attempt to return to the great river a few years later ended in disease, disappointment, and death. He brought with him his wife, Doña Ana de Ayala, whose passage on an ocean voyage in that age is itself a remarkable fact. They hoped to plant a colony on the stream that had carried the first brigantine. The river punished those who had learned too little from it. The attempt foundered on quarrels, bad water, and a geography that would not bend to will. Orellana died near the mouth of the Amazon in the year 1546, a casualty of the world he had revealed. The vision of riverine societies he had recorded through the pen of the friar Gaspar de Carvajal would outlive him and lure others, but the captain himself became one more name on a long list of men who paid for the rumor with their lives. Even within the Andean highlands, far from the heat that consumed lowland parties, the search for confirmation of the legend cost dearly. Companies who marched to the lakes that the Muisca regarded as dwelling places of spirits attempted crude engineering that always ended in the same way. At Lake Guatavita, after the first notch cut into the rim lowered the water only a little, men proposed more elaborate schemes. They sank shafts in the soft slope and tried to tunnel toward the bed to draw off the water in secret. The earth slid, walls collapsed. The lake took back what men tried to claim. A few ornaments winked in the mud at the margins and went straight into the royal fifth, and every one of those glittering finds was read not as a warning but as proof that greater riches lay just below the reach of the hand. The story of the lake became a kind of mirror for the entire century. The more the Spaniards tried to force it, the more it punished them with mud and silence, and the more they convinced themselves that they had almost succeeded. There are passages in the chronicles where the toll is stated with painful clarity. A captain writes that he left Quito with so many Spaniards and so many Indian auxiliaries, and that he returned with a fraction. He notes the horses lost and the dogs eaten. He confesses that he boiled leather and chewed raw maize that had not yet lost its green. He writes that he saw men go blind after eating bitter cassava that had not been properly soaked to leach its poison. He admits that he traded away the last of his silver buttons for a gourd of thin soup in a village whose people had less to spare than he had shame. These witnesses do not tell their own story as tragedy. They set down the facts like a ledger, but the ledger bleeds. Each entry speaks to a habit of mind that conspired with the geography against them. When a village said that rich people lived beyond the ridge, the Spaniards took this not as a formula of deflection or a defense against violence, but as a map. They marched. They suffered. They arrived in a place where different people used similar words, and they marched again. What of the indigenous worlds that met these parties at riverbank and trail? In many places, the communities had long histories of exchange and conflict. The Imagua along the middle Amazon farmed the fertile floodplain and had the habit of flattening the foreheads of infants to express identity. Upstream and down lived other peoples who made pots with intricate incised designs and who raised mounds or built causeways so that their feet stayed dry when the river rose. In the Orinoco country, the Arawak and Carib speaking groups traded fish and salt and ornaments across distances that surprised the newcomers. To these societies, the Spaniards were not the first strangers. They were a new people whose arrival could be resisted, endured, or turned to account, depending on the day and the local memory. Some saw advantage and offered food to obtain iron tools and cloth. Others saw only danger and moved their families inland, leaving gardens to be robbed. Violence, once begun, often spiraled without purpose. A theft by a starving Spaniard at dusk became a dawn skirmish that took the life of a headman, which prompted a retaliation in which a Spanish officer fell to an arrow, which then sparked a punitive raid that burned houses that had sheltered children and elders. In the record, these sequences look like fate. In the villages, they felt like storms. By the middle of the century, the Spanish frontier in the north of South America was a band of towns that held their plazas but not their hinterlands. Santa Marta, Cartagena, Coro, and later Caracas were ports that fed inland hopefuls with iron, seed, and a theology that underestimated the earth. Far inland Santa Fe de Bogotá, Tunja, and Vélez anchored a highland order that sent out probes in every direction. Between these nodes lay thousands of square miles where the rumor walked more easily than any man. Royal officials learned to read incoming letters with practiced skepticism. Every captain promised that his next march would break beyond the ring of uncertainty. Every captain asked for just a little more support before the decisive push. The Council of the Indies sifted the claims and produced paper judgments that mattered little in a world where rivers decided cases by their own rules. To reduce this tapestry of failure to a moral is to miss its human texture, yet a pattern does show. The legend of El Dorado, born from an investiture on a cold lake, had by these years become a traveling horizon. It took the shape of whatever landscape lay ahead of the men who sought it. In the highlands, it became a city. In the grasslands, it became a chain of settlements that would appear with the first rise of ground. In the forests, it became a riverine realm whose granaries stood on stilts. Each mirage had just enough truth in it to compel belief. Gold was indeed worked by Muisca smiths. The Omagua did farm in scale and move goods along water roads. Across the Bolivian and Brazilian lowlands, there were societies that reshaped ground and built towns in patterns that modern eyes, aided by instruments carried in the air, have begun to perceive. The Spaniards were not mad to think that there were large human worlds in the green. They were mistaken to assume that these worlds would present themselves as European treasure houses waiting for a royal fifth. In the end, the roll of the lost is longer than the roll of the triumphant. It includes names preserved in a paragraph and others that slipped away, with no witness but a few bones beneath a stand of trees. It includes men who turned back at the last hour and who carried the rumor to the next recruit who had not yet learned how far a river can stretch a hope. It includes Indians who died because a stranger could not tell the difference between a village that could spare a sack of maize and one that was down to its seed. The promise remained, gleaming just beyond reach, a lure that outlived captains and crowns. What these broken expeditions accomplished, without intending to, was to move the center of gravity of the legend. The plateau had failed to produce a golden city. The lakes had refused to render up their hoard. The word Omagua and the memory of Orellana's passage persuaded many that the secret lay to the east, in a country where water served as road and wall. Cartographers began to inscribe their guesswork upon the empty spaces with new confidence. In the Guyana highlands, an imagined lake appeared on maps with a name that suggested promise rather than proof. Lake Parime was a stroke of ink that said more about yearning than about survey. There were men in the Spanish towns along the Orinoco who thought they could reach its shores if only they were allowed to try. There were men in London who thought that if Spain had failed, England might succeed. From the high country of New Granada, the search turned its face toward the great waterlands of the east. The word that animated the next generation was not a city already taken, but a city imagined with growing certainty. It had a name that sounded like a promise: Manoa. The maps would soon draw a lake to hold it, a round blue oval placed like an eye upon the blankness of Guyana. That lake would be called Parime. The road to both was a braided maze of rivers that few Spaniards yet understood. At the center of this new phase stood Antonio de Berrio, an experienced soldier and a patient administrator, kin by marriage to Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, and heir to both his papers and his unfinished ambition. In the early 1580s, Berrio gathered reports from traders, interpreters, and native pilots who knew the grasses and waterways beyond the eastern scarp. He listened for what endured when tales were stripped of bravado. Time and again he heard of a great basin to the southeast, a plain broken by flat-topped mountains and cut by rivers that turned brown in flood. The people who lived there spoke of an inland sea with settlements along its margin, a place where a powerful lord held court and where wealth in ornaments and fine featherwork announced rank. In the mouths of the Spaniards, the unknown king became El Dorado. In native speech, he was simply the ruler of that country. Berrio resolved to find him. The staging ground for his thrusts was the Orinoco, a river whose headwaters lay not far from the Bogota Plateau, and whose lower course formed a vast mouth on the Caribbean. Unlike the Magdalena, which runs like a single silver strip between mountain spines, the Orinoco sprawls and divides, receives the Meta and the Apure, and sends its waters among islands and sandbars until the sea seems only a widening of itself. Along its banks lived Arawak and Carib-speaking peoples who traded salt, dye woods, fish, and ornaments across distances that astonished newcomers. They knew the short portages that could turn one river into another. They knew where the water was shallow in the dry months and where it rose to the eaves of houses in the rains. Berrio understood that only with such knowledge could any Spaniard hope to travel far. He sought pilots who could read that living map and press them into service with gifts and threats in equal measure. His first ventures from the Orinoco into the Guyana country left a clear pattern on the record. He gathered a few hundred men and many more Indian auxiliaries. He built canoes for cargo and light brigantines for the main party. He moved at a pace set by river stages. At each confluence, he asked his interpreters to repeat the same queries. Where lay the populous lands? What was the name of the largest water to the south and east? Which chief held sway upon its shore? The answers shifted in wording, but not in sense. Farther on, a lake beyond the brush of mountains, a capital called Manoa. Berrio took these as confirmations rather than as lures. By the late 1580s, he had come to believe that this lake was no small lagoon but a true interior sea. He could sketch it on a chart by the light of a camp lamp and place the city on its northern or western shore, depending on which river he had just ascended. He thought that the Parime highlands formed a seamed wall around this basin, and that the roads into it were water roads cut by the Creator from the plateau to the lowlands. What gave these visions their persistence was not only desire but also the nature of the country itself. In the Rupununi and the northern savannas, seasonal rains can spread the waters until they appear to an outsider like a continuous sheet, and then months later, the same ground will show great stretches of grass. A traveler who observes it for a season will see flood. A traveler who listens for generations hears of a lake that comes and goes. Berrio did not know this rhythm. He took the reports at face value and fixed the lake in ink. He founded the town of San José de Oruña on Trinidad in 1592 to serve as a forward base. That island lies like a stepping stone off the delta of the Orinoco, near channels that creep and then widen toward the main stream. From San Jose, he could reach the lower Orinoco in a few days. He could prepare stores without climbing the Andean staircase. He could position messengers to carry news back to the governors of New Granada and to the Council of the Indies. Trinidad also placed him near Carib networks that reached far into the Guianas. The same people who raided for captives and traded for iron would, under pressure or promise, guide him along the waterways that led toward his imagined goal. Berrio made multiple entries from the 1580s into the early 1590s. One thrust carried him up the Caroni, a dark, fast river that falls from the sandstone tablelands and joins the Orinoco in a confluence of foam. Another pressed into the Cuyuni country toward what later ages would call the Gold Belt of Guyana. Each journey taught him the same lesson. The land was not empty. He met chiefs who received him with stately courtesy, and others who gathered for ambush. He saw hamlets strung along levees above the wet season mark. He saw gardens of cassava and maize, and small orchards of fruit that sweetened a day of hard paddling. At night, he heard the drumbeats carry through the forest, and wondered if they were signals sent ahead to warn of his coming. Always there were stories of the larger waters beyond, where canoes could travel for days and never leave sight of the same shore. In these retellings grew the idea that a great lake lay ahead, and that on its rim rose a city with storehouses and a palace. In his reports to superiors, Berrio did what men of his caste always did. He translated a mosaic of testimony into a single picture. He linked what he had seen to what he hoped to see. He spoke of the flat-topped mountains that tower above the green. He repeated the names that rolled off Arawak tongues and wrote them in forms that a clerk in Seville could read. Roraima, Parime, Manoa. He wrote that the inland sea could be reached from the Orinoco by way of the Caroni and the Paragua, or by the Cuyuni, or by the Essequibo to the east. The variety of routes convinced him that Providence had provided many gates to the same treasure house. He did not know that the region also hid a marvel that would confuse even careful geographers. Far to the south, a channel would one day be traced that carried the Orinoco into the Amazon by way of a river called the Cassiquiare. A continent was tied together by water in ways that no European yet guessed. In the absence of accurate knowledge, conjecture fed hope. Every step into the Guianas needed provisions, and every provisioning required a town to draw from. Berrio strengthened Spanish footholds along the lower Orinoco and used Trinidad as a granary and a jail. He rewarded service with grants and promises that only a discovery could redeem. He mortgaged his future on the certainty that Manoa existed. When fatigue gripped his men, he paced the strand and repeated the reasons. Many chiefs speak of the lake. Many trails lead toward it. The story endures from one village to the next. He knew from long service that empty talk dies in a season. This tale did not. That was evidence enough for a captain who had lived his life in rough places. The indigenous intelligence that reached him came from intermediaries who had their own maps of danger and advantage. Arawak pilots might point toward lands that were enemies of their own rivals. Carib traders might steer a Spanish party into a district where their names carried weight and away from another where they were hated. The Spaniards, who suppressed their impatience long enough to notice such cross-currents, gained a sense for the politics beneath the geography. Berrio was better at this work than most. He learned which gifts mattered in which villages. He learned when a chief wanted iron to buy friends, and when he wanted ornaments to announce prestige. He learned to watch how women of a household reacted when men spoke of routes and distances. A flinch could mean a lie. A relaxed hand at a mortar could mean truth. Even with these arts, the picture remained hazy. The land itself conspired with the rumor to deceive. By 1594, Berrio could write with the assurance of a man who had converted hearsay into a plan. The city of Manoa lay upon the shores of Lake Parim. Its ruler was said to go abroad with a guard and with banners, and to receive tribute that ran along water roads for days. The city could be approached from the Orinoco headwaters or from the lower river. He lacked only the final march. In that year and the next, he made ready for a push from Trinidad across to the mainland that would carry him into the Guiana highlands. He drew men from New Granada. He recruited in the islands. He sent envoys to governors for powder and for permission. He moved with the patient energy of a man who knows that one more sustained effort will alter the balance of his fortunes. It was at precisely this point, when his preparations had primed the pump, that a new actor arrived to reshape the theatre. In the spring of 1595, an English fleet eased into the Gulf of Paria and then into the narrows that lead to the Orinoco mouth. Its commander had read enough Spanish letters to know that a great game was in play. He intended to enter it. He would meet Antonio de Berrio on Trinidad, free the island from its governor by force, and pry from his captive every scrap of intelligence that years of labor had gathered. The Englishman's name was Walter Raleigh. The competition for El Dorado was about to leave Spanish hands. The man who carried the legend of Manoa from Spanish letters into the wider imagination of Europe began his adult life far from the Orinoco. Walter Raleigh was a courtier of rare talents, an organizer of voyages, a soldier in Ireland, a poet when the spirit took him, and above all, a confidant of Queen Elizabeth who understood that glory overseas could be turned into influence at home. When he read the Spanish reports and heard of Antonio de Berrio's years on the low, brown rivers that feed the Caribbean, he recognized a stage on which he could play a part. If the Spanish had failed to seize the city of gold, then perhaps an English gentleman backed by the Virgin Queen could succeed. In the spring of 1595, his small fleet appeared off Trinidad. San Jose de Oruña had been founded there only a few years before as Berrio's forward base. Raleigh came ashore with practiced force. The English seized the town, took prisoners, and carried off papers and reports that Berrio had gathered over a decade of probing into Guyana. Berrio himself fell into Raleigh's hands. The Spaniard had every reason to shape the Englishman's view. If Raleigh adopted Berrio's geography, Spanish labors would not be entirely lost. And if England and Spain came to blows over Guyana, the Council of the Indies might yet judge that Berrio had been right all along about the lake and its capital. Raleigh sailed from Trinidad into the great mouth of the Orinoco with Berrio's intelligence as both compass and spur. The ascent of the lower river that followed was a feat of careful seamanship and bold persistence. The Orinoco divides itself at the delta into a lacework of channels, some tidal and some choked with vegetation, and then past the delta, the main stream runs broad and deceptively placid between forested banks. Raleigh took light craft upriver with a small picked company, among them Lawrence Keymis, a loyal lieutenant who would remain bound to the fate of the enterprise for the rest of his life. They rowed and poled their way into reaches where the river narrowed, and its sound grew louder. They met chiefs who had learned in the hard school of the 16th century to weigh newcomers by their gifts, by their respect for custom, and by their willingness to trade rather than seize. Raleigh sat with elders on shaded platforms and listened to accounts of a larger water to the southeast, where an inland sea waxed and waned with the rains. and where a lord, at a place called Manoa, received tribute from villages strung along the shore. He learned names that would become fixed points on English maps of Guyana: the Caroni, dark from the sandstone highlands, which enters the Orinoco in a flood of foam; the Cuyuni and the Mazaruni, which wander among low hills rich in stones that catch the light; the Paragua, a way to cataracts that announce the broken edge of the plateau. Beyond the rivers, the chiefs spoke of mountains with flat crowns and sheer sides that rose like tables from the green. They spoke of an interior basin that in the rains might look like a single water, and in the dry might look like endless savanna. Raleigh had both a soldier's appetite for clear ground and a writer's appetite for image. In his mind, these reports gathered into a picture that felt truer the more he heard it. There was a lake. There was a city. The lake was Parime. The city was Manoa. If a fleet could reach it, England would possess a treasure that would make Peru and Mexico seem but prologues. He did not find gold. He did not reach Manoa. He did what explorers who write well sometimes do. He returned and he published a book that itself became an event. The discovery of Guyana appeared in the year after the voyage and read like a dispatch from a frontier of marvels. Raleigh praised the fertility of the country, the towering trees, and the rivers teeming with fish. He catalogued the peoples. He met with an attention that flatters and unsettles in equal measure, because his admiration for their skill lived alongside his assumption that they would serve the aims of an English crown. He recounted tales he had been told of headless men whose faces grew from their chests, and of other wonders that sit today in that borderland where ethnography meets fable. He wrote in the language of certainty about a city of immense wealth on a lake no map had yet secured. He promised that with little cost to the treasury, England could seize a prize greater than the ransom of Atahualpa, and he reminded his queen that Spain's cruelty in the Indies gave England a moral pretext to act. The book worked on Europe like a bell. Mapmakers drew a blue oval in the Guyana interior and wrote beside it the word Parime. Some placed Manoa on its margin in careful script and drew roads of water that ran to the Orinoco and to the Essequibo, as if Providence had designed the place as a gift to navigators. Traders from Zealand and Amsterdam, who had recently begun to visit the wild coast, traced Raleigh's descriptions with eager fingers. English seamen measured the distance from the Thames to the Orinoco mouth and imagined how a river town could be taken if a bold captain moved swiftly and if the Spaniards were caught unprepared. The Spanish themselves, stung by the theft of their governor and by the spectacle of Englishmen rowing upon their great river, resolved to reinforce their positions. Thus, a chapter that Berrio had expected to author alone became a contest in which many nations had a stake. Politics at home reshaped Raleigh's future. The death of Elizabeth and the accession of James altered the atmosphere around the court. Peace with Spain soon followed. Raleigh, who had prospered in an age of licensed aggression, found himself in a world that valued quiet trade more than raids dressed as discovery. He was accused of treason in a case tangled with court faction and was shut in the Tower of London. From that stone house he watched years pass and watched his Guyanese vision ripen into the dogma of mapmakers who had never felt the Orinoco current. He wrote, he studied, he conducted experiments, and he waited for a turn of fortune that would open the river road again. That turn came at last. In the year 1617, he received permission to sail once more for Guyana, but the royal license carried a condition that a man like Raleigh could find difficult to honor. He was forbidden to fight the King of Spain or his subjects. The charge was to seek mines by the Orinoco that his earlier scouts, especially Keymis, insisted lay near the Spanish post of San Tome on the upper river. If gold could be found without a quarrel, the venture would pay for itself, and the peace would stand. If a quarrel came, the expedition would become a diplomatic crisis that King James would not forgive. Raleigh sailed for the Caribbean with a force that felt to him like a shadow of the old days. He was older, and his body carried the marks of years inside the tower. He anchored at Trinidad, and then dispatched Keymis and a detachment upriver while he remained behind in camp, too ill to bear the long pull against the Orinoco. With Keymis went Raleigh's son, Walter, a young man eager for the chance to win a name where his father had failed. The party ascended past the delta, and into the reaches where the banks rise and the water rolls brown and strong. Spaniards at San Tome had seen English sails before, and they had read Raleigh's book. They were alert. The clash that followed was brief and bloody. In the fighting at the river settlement, Walter Raleigh fell. Keymis brought the news back down the river to his commander, who received it like a man struck in the chest. The restraint the king had ordered was now impossible. It had already been broken by circumstance, or by the logic of a contested frontier. In grief and in disgrace, Keymis took his own life rather than face his captain's sorrow and the sovereign's anger. Raleigh understood that his long gamble had come due. He gathered his men, abandoned the river, and sailed for England to stand before a monarch who had mastered patience but not pity. The Spanish ambassador demanded justice, and justice in this case meant an example. The sentence that had been set aside years before was revived, and in the autumn of 1618 Walter Raleigh went to the scaffold. It is said he steadied the axe with his hand and spoke to the executioner as if arranging a final piece of business. Thus ended the career of the man who had made the city on the lake a subject of English speech. The failure did not erase the effect of his words. For decades after, European maps kept Lake Parim upon their faces, as if the blue oval were a fact given by nature rather than by Raleigh's pen. Dutch outposts along the Essequibo and the Berbice rivers drew their first courage from reports that wealth lay inland if one could only climb past the first rapids and find the true channels. Spanish commanders renewed their efforts to hold the lower Orinoco with stone and with discipline. In London, the tale of a realm richer than Peru became one of those stories that can be taken down from the shelf whenever a minister needs to imagine a new balance of power. Even Raleigh's critics admitted that he had seen with an eye equal to his tongue. He understood that the rivers of Guiana were roads, and that the Table Mountains were landmarks that could guide a careful traveler across months of green. There is a final irony in his part of the story. Raleigh's prose helped to fix a myth in place that later men would spend real lives trying to confirm. The lake he convinced his readers to believe in drew lines on charts and drew parties into the bush. When the lake vanished from respectable maps in the age of Humboldt, it was because surveyors and savants had finally walked the ground long enough to replace inherited certainty with measurement. Between Raleigh's promise and that later correction lies a century and more, in which the dream of Manoa shaped decisions in Madrid, in London, and in the small river towns where the Orinoco bends toward the sea. That is a kind of power as real as gold. It is the power of a compelling story, told by a man who had been on the river, and who wrote as if he could already see the city on its hidden shore. By the end of the 16th century, the city on the lake had become a fixed ornament on European maps. Engravers in Amsterdam and Paris placed a neat blue oval in the interior of Guiana and wrote beside it Lake Parim, with the capital Manoa seated on its shore like a jewel. The picture endured for generations because it was pleasing and because it gave the unknown a shape that merchants and ministers could understand. What unmade the picture was not a single discovery, but a long turn from conquest to measurement. The Enlightenment brought instruments, notebooks, and a suspicion of pleasing errors. Rivers and mountains had to answer to the quadrant and the barometer, rather than to the desire of princes. The change began in fits and starts. In the 1730s, a team of savants from Paris came to Quito to measure the length of a degree of latitude at the equator. They were sent to help decide the shape of the planet. Their mission turned the Andean world into an open book for careful eyes. Charles Marie de la Condamine and his colleagues fought altitude sickness on the ice above Quito, took their triangles across moorland and puna, and then, in 1743, La Condamine chose to ride the rivers to the Atlantic. He descended the Napo and then the Amazon with a trained attention to what had earlier been rumor. He wrote about the blowgun poison curare and about rubber that natives called caoutchouc, a substance no European had seen in quantity. He fixed longitudes and recorded the width of channels and the names of peoples and ports. He did not find a golden city, and in his pages the Amazon is a fact that tolerates no daydream. That tone mattered. It set a standard for what future travelers should consider credible. Jesuit missionaries strengthened the turn to accuracy from another direction. They had been present on the Orinoco since the late 17th century and kept meticulous records because their life depended on it. In 1741, Father José Gumilla published the Orinoco Illustrated, a great compendium of the river's peoples, plants, and floods. He wrote to correct travelers who confused tributaries and who mistook seasonal lakes for seas. A few years later, Father Manuel Roman sent news that astonished Europe. There existed a natural channel, the Cassiquiare, that carried water from the upper Orinoco into the Rio Negro and thence to the Amazon. The report explained a century of confusion on maps. It also trained a generation of geographers to distrust neat boundaries. Water in the north of South America could wander from basin to basin. The more you learned, the less likely an enormous permanent inland sea seemed. Into this newly skeptical world came the most persuasive witness of all. Alexander von Humboldt reached the Caribbean in 1799 and spent 5 years in the tropics with the botanist Aimé Bonpland. He climbed volcanoes in the Andes with barometer and cyanometer. He recorded magnetism and temperature, and he treated geography as a science of relationships rather than as a list of curiosities. In the summer of 1800 he traveled from the Orinoco to the Rio Negro and back by way of the Cassiquiare, proving with his own observations what the Jesuits had reported. He walked and paddled in the very districts where maps placed Lake Parim. He listened to Arawak and Carib pilots describe the seasonal floods that spread across the Rupununi and the northern savannas until a single water seemed to fill the horizon for months at a time. He saw what an earlier captain might have called a sea, and what he, with a mind trained to weigh appearances, called an inundation. In his political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain and in his personal narrative, he wrote that the Grand Lake of Parimé belonged to the history of opinions rather than to the map of the earth. Humboldt's conclusion did not stand alone for long. In the 1830s and 1840s, the British sent Robert Herman Schomburgk to explore and survey what they now called British Guiana. He crossed the Rupununi savannas when they were dry and learned how they looked when they were wet. He climbed the sheer walls of Mount Roraima and saw from that great table of sandstone how water pooled and then withdrew from season to season. He spoke to Makushi guides who knew when the plains became a shallow mirror and when they turned again to grass. Schomburgk's maps mark the supposed site of Parimé, not with a confident oval, but with notes about periodical lakes. He placed Manoa where it belonged in the 18th century, in the company of tales. With each survey, the old ink on old charts faded in authority. Cartography tells this story at a glance. 17th century engravers like Hondius and Sanson printed South America, with Lake Parim engraved as firmly as the Andes. Early 18th century maps kept the lake because no one had replaced it. After La Condamine and Gumilla, some mapmakers shrank it or shifted it further east, as if embarrassment could be cured by caution. After Humboldt and Schomburgk, it begins to disappear from serious atlases. By the middle of the 19th century, the interior of Guyana is webbed with real rivers and dotted with named table mountains and villages. The pleasing blue oval is gone. 150 years of travelers, priests, and surveyors had moved a myth from geography to folklore. The Enlightenment did more than correct a lake. It taught Europeans to ask how a legend could have grown. The answer, assembled piece by piece, honored the peoples whose rights had supplied the seed. Spanish chroniclers had recorded the Muisca investiture at Lake Guatavita from the mouths of elders whose parents had seen it. Archaeologists and collectors in the late colonial period and early republics found hundreds of Muisca votive figures and ornaments, many from lakes and wetlands, which proved that offerings had continued for generations. Naturalists measured the craters and rims of the eastern Cordillera lakes and explained how difficult and dangerous any true draining would be. In that work, the old gold-filled basin became a ritual landscape. In this telling, the Spaniards had mistook devotion for deposit. There is a second thread in the unraveling. The reports of Francisco de Orellana and of Gaspar de Carvajal about the Omagua on the Amazon had been ridiculed by some as exaggerations born of hunger and fear. Enlightenment and early Victorian observers began to find evidence that the friar had seen what he said he saw, not palaces of plate, but riverine societies of scale. On the middle and lower Amazon, travelers like Spix and Martius, and later Bates and Wallace, found long abandoned causeways, raised fields, and signs of complex settlement patterns on high levees. Farther south and west, later scholars would uncover vast networks of earthworks and mounded towns beneath the forest canopy. These findings did not point to a city of gold. They described populous worlds that made sense of older talk about abundance. In other words, reason did not only destroy the legend, it found the human truth inside it. The style of writing changed along with the content. Early chroniclers had blended marvel with description because that is what their readers expected. Enlightenment authors either stripped marvels away or bracketed them as curiosities and then applied a calm voice to measurement. When Humboldt answered Raleigh about Lake Perim, he did it gently, with sentences that read like judgments rather than like refutations. When Schomburg wrote of the Rupununi floods, he did so in a tone that assumed readers would value a clean description of a seasonal lake over a romance. The correction felt authoritative because it respected evidence. When later historians looked back, they saw less a battle between belief and disbelief than a long apprenticeship in the habit of doubt. By the time Perime vanished from the better maps, the very word El Dorado had begun to drift from geography to metaphor. It was used in newspapers to describe a mining strike in California or a new trade at a tropical port. The city on the lake survived in the pages of satirists and poets who understood that a legend can be truer in the realm of character than in the realm of topography. Voltaire would make his tidy mountain utopia out of it. Poe would turn it into a journey through shadow toward an unreachable land. Those are the furnishings of the next part of the tale. What matters here is that the Enlightenment gave the legend an honest place. It set aside the lake that was never there and kept the ceremony that had been real. It kept the river journey that recorded intricate societies and set aside the palace plated in yellow. It did not sneer. It corrected. There is a final image to fix the change. In an old atlas, Lake Perim sits like a sapphire in the middle of Guyana, with little to explain it. In a later one, a notation near the Rupununi speaks of seasonal inundations and of a country where water travels both to the Orinoco and to the Amazon. In the margin, a note cites a traveler who took barometer readings and angles at noon and wrote down the names he learned with care. Between the two maps lies the difference between a hope and a measurement. That difference is the Enlightenment's gift to this story. El Dorado survived the age of measurement by slipping into the language of desire. Once the lake drained away from the maps, the name did not vanish. It moved from geography to metaphor, from the face of the world to the face of a coin and the headline of a newspaper. A myth that had guided captains now guided the imagination of readers, prospectors, and politicians. That transfer is the essence of its legacy. It explains why a story born on a high Andean lake could echo in places that never knew the Muisca or the Orinoco. Writers were the first custodians of the remade legend. In the year 1759, Voltaire set his hero down in a mountain valley called El Dorado, a tidy utopia where gold and jewels were as common as pebbles and as lightly regarded. The satire had bite. By making wealth worthless in the one happy society in his tale, Voltaire mocked the European fever for bullion and the cruelty that accompanied it. 3 generations later, Edgar Allan Poe took up the theme in a different key. His poem El Dorado follows a knight who rides through seasons and into shadow seeking a land that recedes with every mile, a parable of obsession that reads like a verdict on a century of failed entradas. In both cases, the literary El Dorado is not a prize. It is a mirror held up to the seeker. The word soon traveled from page to place. In the year 1848, gold was found at Sutter's Mill on the American River, and within a year, California's legislature had a county named El Dorado. Prospectors carried the name across the Cordillera to Colorado, to the Black Hills, and north to the Klondike. Newspapers wrote of new El Dorados on every continent when a seam was struck or a field discovered. The transmutation was complete. El Dorado had ceased to be a particular city. It had become any place where hope and metal met. In the decade of the California rush, a hotel called the El Dorado offered beds to men who dreamed of reefs and placers, and a steamship called the El Dorado hauled them up the coast. When the mines gave out and the boats moved on, the name remained. It had joined the permanent vocabulary of promise. The legend also reshaped museums and collecting. In Bogota, the Gold Museum grew into a kind of secular chapel for the ritual objects that had once been cast into lakes around the Muisca Plateau. Tunjos of human and animal form, nose ornaments with delicate struts, and the small raft that shows a chief flanked by attendants in the moment before the offering, all tell a story more intricate and humane than the old talk of vaults beneath the water. Visitors who stare into those glass cases are invited to see gold as the Muisca saw it, not as coin but as a charged medium for prayer and renewal. That reframing is part of the legacy. It redeems a piece of the legend by returning it to its source. For the peoples who endured the 16th century, the word carries a harder memory. To them, the legacy includes the violence that rumor licensed. Expeditions searching for El Dorado took food without agreement and labor without pay. They burned gardens in reprisal and punished villages for the words of guides who misled them. Communities learned to slip away when strangers appeared, to fence off their children from threat, to suffer interrogations from men who insisted that an answer had to point toward treasure. The memory crossed generations. In the Orinoco country, old people told young ones where to hide when a column came along the levee, and when to watch from the trees instead. In the Amazonas, longhouse elders passed on the names of ancestors who had fought men in steel hats on the beaches of islands that were gardens in the dry season and mere high spots in the rains. The cultural legacy, if it is told honestly, must include these quiet strategies for survival. European states made use of the legend in another way. El Dorado became an argument in the great contest for empire. Spain's rivals circulated tales of a golden land neglected or abused by the crown, and with that tale sought permission to insert themselves in territories that Spanish ordinances claimed. England and the Dutch Republic did this in Guyana in the late 16th and 17th centuries, drawing on Raleigh's words and on rumors that drifted along the wild coast from the Essequibo to the Marowijne. Inside Spain, royal councils used the same legend to spur governors and captains, to justify funds, and to shift blame when expeditions failed to return. In both cases, the City of Gold was a political instrument. It gathered the hopes of investors and cloaked agendas in a language the public understood. Cartography absorbed the lessons slowly. For 2 centuries, mapmakers had accorded Lake Parime the dignity of ink and the city of Manoa the honor of a neat serif hand. When Humboldt and Schomburg closed that chapter with measurements and careful testimony, they did more than correct a picture. They showed how myths harden when they have a place to sit on the page. Later, atlases that removed the oval and added the true meanders of the Rupununi were teaching tools in themselves. They trained readers to accept the authority of a river with a name instead of the comfort of a lake that had pleased their fathers. That is part of the legend's legacy as well. It lives in the development of the skeptical habit. The arts continued to draw on El Dorado because artists understood how the myth spoke to universal themes. Painters in Europe and in the Americas pictured gilded kings on rafts gliding across green water. Adventurers in novels fixed their eyes on a horizon that shimmered with metal and heat. In the 20th century, the name appeared in films and in songs, often with a wry smile that admitted the gap between dream and fact. The road to El Dorado imagined the fable with charm, and pulp adventures set their heroes under waterfalls that poured from table mountains like curtains. In modern journalism, the word appears whenever a frontier promises sudden wealth. It has been used to describe oil fields in the Orinoco Belt and to describe strikes in the highlands of New Guinea. In finance pages, an El Dorado is a market that seems to mint money until the cycle turns. In technology writing, it is a metaphor for a new platform that promises untold scale. The name persists because it expresses desire in a single phrase. There is also a scholarly legacy that is less visible to the public but fundamental to how we understand the past. Historians of the Americas use El Dorado as a case study in the production of knowledge. They trace how a ritual act was misunderstood, how testimony changed as it moved through languages, and how cartographic convention can stabilize a conjecture for generations. Archaeologists working in the Amazon and in the Orinoco Basin have used the controversy around Carvajal's account of the Omagua to frame questions about scale and settlement. Soil scientists, botanists, and geographers have added to that picture by identifying terra preta, the rich anthropogenic soil created by long residents, and by mapping ancient causeways and mounds that lay beneath the canopy. These discoveries do not revive a city of gold. They honor complex societies that early travelers glimpsed and later readers dismissed. The myth has thus served as a goad to better research. Modern Colombia has folded the story into national heritage with a mixture of caution and pride. Lake Guatavita is protected as a natural and cultural site. Visitors walk up through scrub and eucalyptus to a lookout above the circular water and hear guides tell the story of the Gilded Lord in a way that gives honor to the Muisca. The town of Guatavita, relocated in the 20th century to save it from flood, has a plaza where the white walls catch the afternoon light and where artisans sell replicas of ancient ornaments in legal commerce rather than in clandestine trade. Schoolbooks teach children that the legend is born from a real ceremony and that the ceremony meant gift and renewal rather than greed. That shift in emphasis is a moral legacy. It asks a new generation to see value where their ancestors were taught to see only metal. In the end, the legend belongs to a small family of stories that have outsized influence because they give shape to longing. Atlantis tells of a lost perfection. The 7 cities of Cybele tell of a frontier made of rumor. El Dorado tells of a promise that moves just ahead of the traveler and never stops. It is a warning and a lure. It can make a man throw his life into a river, or it can make a writer craft a parable, or it can make a community guard a lake because their grandparents cast gifts into it. The enduring power of the story lies in that range. It can be caution or celebration. It can be self-deception or self-knowledge. It is a test that each age applies to itself by asking a single question. What do we chase, and at what cost? By the opening of the new century, the legend no longer rode in the saddlebags of conquistadors. It traveled instead in field notebooks, government permits, and the pages of illustrated magazines. The dream had not changed, only the methods had. Men still believed that somewhere in the vast river countries of the north of South America, there had been cities of unusual wealth and scale. They meant to find proof. Some carried sextants and prismatic compasses. Some hired steam pumps and gangs of laborers. Some brought a faith that borders on devotion and paid the price that devotion often exacts. One of the earliest modern scenes belongs to Lake Guatavita. In the year 1898, a British enterprise convinced itself that the old offerings could be made to yield to machinery and will. Surveyors marked a line near the low point on the crater rim. Crews cut a tunnel through the earthen wall and installed pumps. As the water fell, the ring of exposed mud widened like a clock that slowly turns. For the first time in what may have been centuries, the lake offered up a band of its bed to the open air. Fortune did not favor the venture. The equatorial sun baked the newly exposed ooze into a hard crust that defied shovels. Mud that had seemed soft enough to yield its secrets set like mortar. Men scraped ornaments from the margins and pulled a few small pieces of cast metal from clotted banks. Very little of value emerged from the deeper floor before the tunnel failed. Water returned, and the backers went home with a list of expenses and a handful of trophies. The episode would be repeated in smaller ways in the early years of the 20th century. Each attempt said more about the persistence of a story than about the lake itself. By the middle of the century, Colombia had declared Guatavita a protected site. The crater held its green circle in peace, and the search for El Dorado turned away from engineering and toward scholarship. In the new century, the most famous seeker was a tall Englishman with a soldier's carriage and a surveyor's eye. Percy Harrison Fawcett learned his craft with the Royal Geographical Society and then served on a series of boundary commissions in the interior of South America. He ran lines between Bolivia and Brazil, and he walked the uplands along the headwaters of the Rio Verde and the Rio Heath with a compass in his hand and a barometer in his pack. His reports to London mixed hard figures with incidents that made readers lean in. He wrote of a snake the length of a crude canoe, of arrows that thudded into trees like mallets, and of the silence that falls in a forest when a jaguar slips close. These were not idle anecdotes. They were the way a man told distant superiors that he knew the country and could be trusted to judge it. Fawcett became convinced that the interior had once held a large town or a network of towns, a place he called simply Z. The name was spare by design. It made no promises about gold. It did not dress the quest in old Spanish clothes. It signaled a destination that would be described when it was reached. He collected hints where he found them. An old Portuguese document known as Manuscript 512 described a noble ruin in the Brazilian interior. Natives in the savannah north of the Xingu spoke of earthworks and old causeways. Botanists remarked that patches of dark soil, much richer than the surrounding earth, appeared near old settlement sites. These bits did not yet cohere into proof. They were enough to convince a man who had walked these distances that the interior could have held a larger population than the 19th century imagined. In the year 1925, Fawcett set out from Cuiabá with a small party for what he intended to be the final push. He took his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel, and very little else. He believed that a small group could move faster and avoid the friction of large expeditions. He wrote a last letter from a camp he called Dead Horse, the place where during an earlier survey he had been forced to shoot an exhausted mount. Then he turned east and vanished into the forest north of the Xingu. For months, the newspapers printed rumors. Friendly Indians had adopted the party and would present them in triumph. Hostile tribes had killed them. A fever had carried them off. In time, the rumors became a cautionary fable. Fawcett had gone farther than prudence allowed in a land that does not forgive mistakes. He joined the long roll of those whom El Dorado keeps for its own. The century did not record only losses. In 1969, a farmer exploring a cave near Pasca brought into the light a small cast object that had spent centuries in the dark. It was a golden raft, no longer than a hand, bearing at its center a standing figure flanked by attendants. The chief spreads his arms, and the offerings lie in mounds at his feet. The whole scene is held on a lattice that suggests reeds and cane. Here at last was a Muisca artist's rendering of the investiture on the lake. The object now sits in the Gold Museum in Bogotá, and it has become the single most eloquent artifact in the entire long debate. It does not confirm a city of gold. It confirms a ceremony in which gold served as a sacred medium. In a few inches of cast alloy, it vindicates what elders told Spanish chroniclers in the 17th century, and what later scholars suspected. The seed of the legend was real. Archaeology in the basin made slower progress. For a long while, a theory ruled that the poor soils of the Amazon could not support dense populations, and that the apparent abundance described by early travelers was an illusion. Then, in the late years of the century and the first years of the next, the ground began to argue with that theory. Anthropologists working among the Kwikuro and other peoples of the Upper Xingu documented networks of villages linked by roads and surrounded by fish weirs and raised fields. Soil scientists mapped terra preta, rich black earth created by long human residence, and found it spread in patches far along river courses. In the Bolivian lowlands, where seasonal waters flood the plains and then recede, aerial photographs revealed causeways and mounds that stitched together an agrarian landscape of remarkable scale. Evidence accumulated that Orellana and the Friar Carvajal had indeed drifted through a river world more populous than later visitors imagined, a world that was fractured by disease and disruption in the first century after contact, and that had not yet recovered when later observers arrived. Late in the century, technology lifted the canopy. Satellite images and then airborne laser scanning made it possible to strip the green from the model and see the ghostly geometry beneath. In the Llanos de Mojos, archaeologists traced long straight causeways across miles of savanna, saw platforms that once held pyramidal mounds, and mapped settlements arranged in planned patterns. Excavations confirmed that these were not fantasies of the censor, but the footprint of an old order. None of this work revived the notion of a single city of gold. All of it made plausible the idea that there had been organized polities in the interior when the first Europeans arrived, polities that could have given birth to stories of abundance and to the notion that somewhere just beyond the horizon a ruler held court in splendor. Treasure hunting did not end with enlightenment. A few private schemes still raised money to test the lakes around the Bogotá Plateau or to pry at the edges of Guatavita. Laws and a growing respect for heritage brought that to a close. The country chose to keep the past intact rather than to gamble for a few more trinkets. The meaning of the search changed in those years. What had begun as a quest for precious metal became an inquiry into how societies make meaning from matter. Museums built cases that teach rather than dazzle. Guides on the path to Guatavita now tell visitors that the shining dust on a ruler's skin was a sign of a covenant rather than the first step in a bank withdrawal. By the final years of the century, the legend had been reframed by evidence. The lake that never existed on the map was gone. The ritual that had existed on a different lake had been given a face. The river that some had treated as a wilderness had been recognized as a corridor of societies that rose and fell. What remained was the human appetite that launched the story in the first place. The modern tools that reveal ancient towns from the air and pull figurines from the earth do not quiet that appetite. They redirect it. The hunt has moved from rumor to instruments, from coercion to consent, from the seizure of offerings to the patient reading of landscapes. The dream now is that the ground itself will tell us what lies under the green, and that in listening we will recover not treasure, but a truer account of the people who lived there. In our century, the legend lives in two places at once. It lives in the galleries of museums where small figures of gold sit beneath clear glass, and it lives in the unquiet part of the mind that still believes there must be a place where wealth and wonder coincide. The story has shed armor and horse bells. It wears conservation badges and research permits now. Yet when a visitor stands above the green circle of Guatavita in the thin air of the eastern Cordillera, the old current moves again. People fall silent. They try to imagine a raft, a gilded body, and the moment when treasure left human hands and slipped into the depth. Modern Colombia has made the care of that scene a matter of policy rather than romance. The crater lake above the town that bears its name is protected land. Footpaths and railings guide the climb to the rim. Guides tell the story as a ritual of gift and renewal, rather than as the prologue to a vault. A few hours away in Bogotá, the Gold Museum has become a civic catechism that turns metal into memory. Visitors trace Muisca work through cases of tunjos and diadems, and then stop before the small raft from the cave near Pasca. The tableau repays long looking. The tiny chief stands open, armed as if acknowledging a covenant rather than displaying power. When a school group clusters before that case, Colombian teachers explain that gold was a sacred medium, that wealth in this story is not coin, and that the European hunger that followed the rumor mistook the meaning of almost every object it touched. That instruction is part of the modern legend. It is an ethical footnote written onto a tale once told as conquest. The Guiana country has folded its own parts of the story into local life. On the Essequibo and the Berbice, Dutch and British place names sit beside Arawak and Carib ones. River towns carry a casual knowledge of Raleigh and of Barrio, not as heroes, but as early travelers, whose maps opened paths for merchants and missionaries, and for quarrels about borders that have not entirely ended. The inland highlands, with their table-topped mountains and waterfalls that drop from stone lips into mist, now draw hikers who carry cameras and sample bottles instead of swords. Park rangers speak of trails and of fragile plants. And pilots circle the flat crowns that once peered out of Raleigh's pages, as if they were stages for the city beyond the basin. The region has learned to live with a myth by offering the land itself as the marvel. The legend also survives on screens and in the popular press. In the early years of this century, a narrative journalist wrote the story of Percy Fawcett under the plain title of The Lost City of Zed, and the book carried the old hunger into a modern form. It introduced a new generation to a surveyor who vanished beyond the Xingu, and to the puzzle of whether his faith in an interior civilization held water. A film followed, and sent audiences walking through green shadows under a score that thrummed like distant thunder. Even the lighter touch endures. An animated feature about a golden city set young viewers laughing, while it taught adults that the genre of the quest still draws because it promises transformation. Each new telling shifts the emphasis. The best of them exchange certainty for humility. They leave the river to the river and look harder at the people whose ancestors lived along its banks. Science has taken up what rumor began. In the Bolivian lowlands, where seasonal waters braid and recede, archaeologists have used satellite images and airborne laser scans to peel away the canopy in the model and reveal straight causeways, paired mounds, and planned town sites. Soil scientists describe patches of dark earth created by long residence and deliberate burning, proof that people shaped the land not as a cruelty, but as a long patience. Farther north in the Xingu, work with present-day communities shows how networks of villages, once related by roads and plazas, made a fabric of settlement that an early traveler might have read as a kingdom spread thin. None of this produces a palace plated in yellow. All of it dignifies what Orellana and the Friar Carvajal tried to say. They drifted through a populous corridor, and later eyes, arriving after plague and disruption, mistook absence for an original emptiness. The legend continues to cast a shadow in the language of extraction. When newspapers write of a new field in the Orinoco belt, or of a mining rush on a Tepuy flank, the old word appears to lend a glow to the prospects. The term is a spell that can make risk look like destiny. It is worth noting the other side of that spell. Mines bite into fragile watersheds. Camps arrive faster than schools. In every new El Dorado, there is a story that begins with a caravan and ends with a landfill. The modern caution is to hear the name and to ask what price will be paid by the river and by the people who live near it. That too is part of the legacy now. The tale teaches readers to interrogate their own appetite for a quick transformation. Museums and communities have begun to speak to each other in a way that earlier centuries did not permit. Repatriation has entered the conversation. Loans move in two directions. Exhibitions travel not simply to dazzle, but to explain. In Bogotá and in regional museums along the Cordillera, curators cast their work as a partnership with descendants of the makers. The object on the plinth is not mute. It is introduced with the name of the people who made it, and with a careful account of why it looked as it did and where it was found. That is a different end to the story than the conquistador imagined. It honors the first meaning that the objects carried, and then explains how a second meaning, the European one, grew like a burr on a bright cloth and would not let go. Tourism now walks the edges of sites that older hunters would have dug. At Guatavita, the path climbs to a viewpoint where visitors stand in quiet and then descend without leaving scars. On the Orinoco, you can sit in a canoe under a sky that looks the size of a sea and watch a sandbar turn purple in evening light. A guide will point at a line of forest and tell a story whose shape is old and whose substance is new. He will say that a city of gold never stood there. And then he will say that people have lived along these waters for a very long time, and that their houses and gardens and mounds can still be traced if you know where to look. That is the two-part truth that the modern legend carries. The myth is false as geography and true as a record of human longing, and the land beneath the myth is richer in history than the old hunger ever suspected. The word has also kept its place in speech as a measure of ambition. A new invention is hailed as an El Dorado for investors. A medical breakthrough is called an El Dorado for patients. The phrase can be lazy when it papers over the difficulty of real work, but it is not without use. It reminds us that people reach beyond what they can count. It also reminds us that every golden promise must be tested against the stubbornness of the world. The moral that emerges from 5 centuries of pursuit is plain. A dream can move armies. It can also be refined into a question that can be answered. The best modern work in the lands that once held the rumor does not ask where the city is. It asks what the people who lived there built, how they exchanged and worshipped and grew, and how their choices shaped the soil itself. If there is an ending to be written for this story, it is an ending that replaces possession with understanding. The gilded chief who once stood on a raft does not point to a hidden hoard. He points to a different idea of wealth. The value that survives the test of time is the value of a ceremony that binds a community to the powers it reveres, the value of knowledge patiently gathered, and the value of a landscape seen as a partner rather than as a prize. The city of gold remains a figure of speech. The real treasure lies in the long recovery of voices that the first hunters could not hear.